The cup of coffee sat untouched on the saucer, steam rising in slow spirals that caught the late afternoon sun and threw small, trembling halos across the table. Lucas Reed watched the vapor as if it were a fragile map he could trace with his eyes to find a way out of the room. The cafe smelled of burnt sugar and espresso, a faint undernote of citrus from someone else's scones. The scrape of a chair on tile sounded like a soft insistence, and the leather of his jacket felt rough against the smooth edge of the table where his knuckles rubbed absent-mindedly. He had been careful for months to keep his life small and manageable, to plan routes, to avoid stairs, to accept that friends drifted away. The wheelchair fit him like a kind of armor and like a public label at the same time. 3 years after the crash, the world still measured him in pity before it measured him in presence. He lived inside a steady, low ache, an inward weather of fatigue and shame that did not always need words. Solitude had become not only routine, but proof that he could stand on his own, even when standing meant learning new ways to be. He had learned to laugh at the right moments and to withdraw at the first sign of questions that dug too deep. There was pride beneath that withdrawal too, pride that had once built small careers and that now defended him from the vulnerability that asking for help required. He did not like to owe anyone anything, least of all kindness that compromised his privacy. At a corner table, a little girl with a bob of straight hair and mismatched socks tugged at the sleeve of a woman who wore the tired badge of a nurse, a uniform that had seen too many late nights. The child blinked in the sun, her small fingers sticky from a chocolate chip cookie, and asked plainly, "Mom, why is that man alone?" Her voice was high and unadorned, a simple investigation that cut through the noise of Lucas's self-protective narratives. The woman, Hannah, smiled with an exhausted softness and said, "He is not alone, unless we let him be. Do you want to say hello?" She set down her travel mug that smelled faintly of peppermint and pushed a chair forward with a deliberate, gentle motion. Lucas did not know whether he expected the question to trigger a reflex of irritation. Instead, when the little girl, Maya, inclined her head and offered a cookie as if it were a trade, he felt a part of his armor loosen. Maya's fingers were warm and sticky, and her knuckles freckled, and the cookie left a trace of melted chocolate on his palm when he accepted. The cafe around them softened into peripheral sound, spoons clinking, low conversation, the hiss of the milk frother, the steady hum of the extractor fan. "My name is Lucas," he said. His voice sounded smaller than he remembered, and honest in a way it had not been in years. "Nice to meet you, Maya." "Are you sad about your leg?" she asked without judgment. The question was direct in the way only a child can be. Hannah answered for them in a low, practical voice that carried the cadence of a shift change. "He's been through a lot. Sometimes people get quiet when they are tired inside." That small, careful summary was neither intrusive nor weighted. It simply made a place in the conversation for what might come next. Mateo, a barista with an easy laugh and an ear for people's stories, leaned over the counter and said, "Tell him about the dinosaur plaster, Maya. You said it makes everyone brave." The little girl laughed and leaned forward, and the room smelled suddenly of citrus from her orange juice and something warm from the cinnamon rolls on the nearby tray. The chair pulled closer. The barrier between Lucas and the rest of the cafe reduced to inches of air and a shared pastry. Nor did this feel like pity. It felt like an opening. For Lucas, that opening promised the possibility of something less practiced than his armor, something that could be fragile and, if attended, might become steadier. He accepted the invitation to conversation because at that moment the choice to retreat felt smaller than the choice to try. It was a small transaction, a traded cookie, a name spoken aloud, a kindness offered without ledger. Yet it would be the hinge on which the months ahead turned. The early part of their conversation was the kind of measured, awkward generosity that unfamiliar adults exchange with a child at the center. And it took several small beats before it reached the more intricate territory of lives intersecting. Conversations in the cafe unfolded in a series of short acts. Maya wanted to know whether Lucas liked dinosaurs or spaceships more. Hannah, careful where she set her hands on the table, asked whether he had family nearby. Lucas answered with small, accurate facts, and then with a story he had practiced on strangers when he needed to answer personal questions without giving away the ache below. I used to work in design. I liked making things that helped people move through a city without feeling crushed by it. That was true in the blandest sense. It left out the truth about the accident the year he had driven home through rain and a streetlight that failed. The omission was intentional protection. But as the afternoon unfurled, the lines softened. The conversation grew thicker with details of lost routines and adapted ones, with Hannah telling about night shifts and late pancakes, with Mateo chiming in about the day a busker played an accordion badly but insistently outside the shop, and how the park near Lucas's building now had 2 new benches because someone had paid attention. It took 11 clear exchanges for the moment to settle into something that felt like the start of a relationship. Each voice entered and left the scene, small moments of difference colliding into a single human flow. "Do you miss walking?" Maya asked. "Sometimes," Lucas admitted. "Do you like museums?" she pressed. "Yes, I used to go to one every year and pretend the models were friends," he said, smiling. "We could go together," Maya proposed. "When?" she asked. "When the weather is not raining," Lucas said, and the promise hung there, both fragile and concrete. 30 minutes in, Lucas felt an unfamiliar willingness to exchange more than polite facts. He told them about how the apartment above the bookstore had too many stairs, and how he had learned to rearrange his life to fit the routes that were accessible. He described, almost casually, the generosity and the retraction that had defined his recent years. There were 6 sensory notes threaded through the conversation that kept returning like a chorus. The tactile warmth of the cookie, the shrinking light through the cafe window, the low electrical buzz of the espresso machine, the peppermint tang on Hannah breath, the squeak of the wheelchair as Lucas shifted, the sweet metallic tang of the coins in the tip jar when Mateo counted them at a lull. Each detail circled back in small echoes throughout the day, and later, in memory, would act as an anchor he could revisit when the world felt slippery. When they agreed to meet again, a modest promise to take a short walk to the small modern art museum 2 blocks away that had an accessible entrance, Lucas felt a thin thread of hope begin to stitch through his chest. He was tentative in locking his own expectations to the promise. He did not believe in sudden healings. He believed instead in small commitments kept over time. That afternoon, walking to the elevator with Hannah holding the door and Maya chattering about dinosaur stickers, Lucas made a tiny concession to the possibility that his life could widen. That was the promise set in motion, a series of small encounters that could, with attention, remap him. The next weeks settled into a pattern neither rushed nor complacent. There were visits to the museum, mornings in the community garden with a volunteer named Claire who brought extra gloves, evenings in which Lucas helped Mateo design a simple ramp for the cafe back door, and learned to use a small set of tools under the watchful, patient eye of an older neighbor, Elijah, who had once been a carpenter. Names accumulated around him like a scaffolding of ordinary commitments. Each person contributed an element to the web that held him. Emma, a physical therapist who worked at the hospital down the street, began to volunteer advice. She lent him a set of resistance bands and encouraged a modest routine. Sophia, a social worker from the community center, introduced options for an accessibility grant that could help offset some of the Lucas wanted for his building. Dr. Aaron Patel would later appear as the surgeon who evaluated a different problem, but at this stage he was a name on a pamphlet mentioned by Emma as someone thorough and steady. Yet even as the circle grew, so did the small eruptions of doubt and shame that lived as muscle memory. One evening, after a series of small wins installing handrails in the stairwell and after teaching a short community workshop about accessible design at the library where Claire worked, Lucas sat alone on his building stoop, watching rain begin to make the sidewalk shine. The improvements did not dissolve the memory of that night, nor did they change the slow, practical ways in which insurance and municipal bureaucracy took time and patience. Pride returned like a reflexive tide whenever he thought of accepting help as a transactional loss. The people who offered him kindness did not ask for repayment, but that did not always ease the complicated ledger in his head. He was learning, slowly, the difference between owing and receiving, and that the two were not necessarily the same. Backstory for Lucas. Lucas Reed was once a logistics designer who specialized in public spaces. He had a decade of steady work building small structures into the fabric of a city, benches that invited rest, ramps that felt graceful, not clumsy, pathways that led people to small scenes of respite. He was methodical, meticulous, a person who kept a precise calendar and owned his routines like tools. The accident came in a half-hour of rain that hit an oil slick and a streetlight that flickered out. He survived. He lost a portion of his mobility and many of the familiar shapes of his life. That loss reframed him. He learned new mechanics of moving through the world. He learned the vocabulary of medical visits and physical therapy and assistive devices. And he learned how public structures could either support or erase the dignity of someone who moved differently. His backstory was not just about injury. It was about a mind retrained to notice design in everyday kindnesses and omissions. Friends who had been colleagues moved on. The city around him kept adjusting, but slowly. He kept designing in small projects, and he kept making room in his life for the kind of solitude that felt safe and under his control. Backstory for Hannah. Hannah Alvarez was a registered nurse and single mother who worked on the respiratory ward. Her nights were built of careful triage and the soft, patient monotone of reassurance. Once, she had balanced graduate school and night shifts and a marriage that dissolved quietly over bills and unanswered questions. She had learned to measure her commitments in practical increments: hours at work, homework time with Maya, sleep stolen in the breaks. She carried stories of patients who had no one to visit them, and she carried a belief that small human contact mattered. She saw loneliness and she had little patience for displays of performative pity, and a lot of time for hands that reached out and did small things to make someone more comfortable. The promise of continued contact drove both Lucas and Hannah into new territory. Hannah was not a person who planned to counsel men in cafes. She had simply recognized an opportunity to teach Maya about noticing someone with attention rather than judgment. But the small acts of listening that began in that first meeting turned into more synchronous exchanges. They traded brief messages about exhibitions at the museum, about accessibility hours at local venues, about a community fundraiser Claire worked on to raise money for a local playground with inclusive equipment. Lucas, who had been wary of fundraising and of asking for help, found himself, slowly, accepting the idea that community could build tangible things for fragile lives, and that accepting donations or volunteer labor was not a surrender of dignity. Not everything was gradual or gentle. The first challenge came in the form of a medical complication not directly related to his prior injury. On a routine check, he mentioned to Emma a new, persistent tightness in his chest and a fatigue that sulked under his day. She listened and arranged an appointment. The tests returned a concern, an arrhythmia that, although not immediately life-threatening, might require an electrophysiological study and perhaps a small procedure to correct an irregular conduction pathway. The technical explanation Emma relayed was short and clear. The electrophysiology study is a minimally invasive procedure that maps the heart's electrical signals, using catheters threaded through the femoral vein to the heart for internal recording and possible ablation of problematic tissue. Recovery is usually 2 to 4 weeks with precautions and a period of limited physical exertion. The details comforted and frightened him in equal measure. The explanation occupied roughly 300 characters when she summarized it in her message, precise and practical and not sensational. The referral set in motion an administrative tangle of approvals and scheduling that tested his newly forming network. Sophia stepped in, helping navigate insurance and paperwork, while Dr. Aaron Patel reviewed the scans at the university clinic and explained the likely steps. The moment of agreeing to the procedure opened new tensions. Lucas had to invite not only medical professionals into his body, but also the economy of care that demanded someone be present during recovery. He did not want to ask for help. He did not want to accept the role of patient who could not independently secure basic necessities for his life during convalescence. The confrontation between pride and vulnerability culminated in a scene at the clinic where there were 12 exchanges, the kind of procedural dialogue that leaves a person feeling both reassured and stripped. Lucas sat in a clinical chair, the smell of antiseptic paper and the faint chemistry of latex gloves filling the bypassed spaces. Dr. Aaron Patel, who had a voice like a steady hammer and eyes that read the diagnostic data without theatrics, said, "We can proceed with mapping, then ablation if indicated. The success rate is high and the risk low." Lucas asked, "How long will I be out of work?" Hannah, who had come with him at that appointment, answered softly, "A couple of weeks, maybe longer with complications." Emma added, "We will set up a home safety plan. I can come by for one of the first sessions." Sophia said, "There is a grant that covers caregiver hours for eligible people. Let me file the paperwork." The exchanges were practical, human, and necessary. There were 10 more lines back and forth as they planned the logistics, with Mateo volunteering to help with grocery runs and Claire offering to schedule volunteers for odd jobs in the apartment. The moment felt like a small committee forming around a person who had previously tried to be solitary. That committee, that newly formed skeleton of a community, was not frictionless. There were moments of awkwardness, when Lucas misheard kindness as pity, when Hannah worried whether Maya's buoyant interventions were naive, when Sophia pushed forms and he refused. Each disagreement was itself an opportunity for negotiation. The moral question that persisted through many scenes was simple and stubborn. Was it pride or prudence that made Lucas resist help? When does independence shade into isolation, and when does community shade into codependency? They talked about it directly at times and circled it at others. One evening, over a dinner that was mostly pasta and reheated vegetables, Lucas said, "I am not trying to be ungrateful. I just want to be the kind of person who can manage." Hannah shook her head with a tired, sarcastic smile and said, "Managing alone has its costs, Lucas. Sometimes the cost is the thing you don't notice until it is gone." These conversations allowed both of them to name the ethical stakes of their intimacy. A major tension occurred the day before the procedure when an administrative delay threatened to push the surgery date out by weeks. This setback compressed the community's energy into a focused, anxious effort to get approvals. The air under that tension had a metallic quality, like the sting of static in an enclosed room. Emails pinged and phones buzzed. Sophia paced the corridor of the clinic and spoke quickly into the phone with an advocate who promised to escalate the case. Lucas sat with a cup of hospital coffee that tasted faintly medicinal and watched Maya color a picture with crayons she had carried in her small backpack. Mateo moved through logistical errands like a conductor trying to keep multiple sections in tempo. This period was a crucible. The delay offered a chance for frustration to harden into resignation, or for the group to show that their attachments had weight. They chose weight. The approvals came through late that night, and everyone breathed in a low chorus relief. The procedure itself carried exactly the kind of prolonged tension the group feared and the clinicians managed. In the pre-op room, Lucas lay with a warm blanket and an IV line in his arm. The nurse checked his identification band twice, pressing gently along his wrist with a thumb that left a small warm trace. The operating theater was a room of light and clinical noise. Monitors beeped in a steady, reassuring rhythm with a deeper underlying frequency that felt like ocean swell. His breath felt small and irregular. Dr. Patel sat across the console, and the anesthetist, Claire, who had once been his neighbor at a different period in life and shared the same first name as the volunteer, whispered steps and timelines and probabilities. There were 5 moments of acute tension in the arc of the operation day and the immediate aftermath, each developed to its necessary emotional weight. One moment occurred when a catheter encountered unexpected resistance and the team paused to image, their faces drawn tight over the monitors. The pause was long enough to feel like a small eternity and short enough that skills and protocol ruled. Another moment was the brief arrhythmia episode in the recovery bay that startled everyone until the nurses calmly intervened and restored rhythm with medication. A separate tension unfolded when insurance flagged an unexplained code and delayed a post-op discharge summary that had to be clarified in real time, requiring Sophia to speak with a billing advocate and for Lucas to remain patient under strain. A quieter tension lived in the way Lucas worried that the team would see his vulnerability as burden. The last acute tension was personal and intangible, a flash of panic about losing the promise he had made to Maya to visit the museum in spring if everything went well. The clinical descriptions were precise without being cold. The electrophysiological study involved mapping cardiac conduction with intracardiac catheters, recording complex arrhythmic signals, and applying radiofrequency energy to ablate a small focus of tissue. Patients were sedated but maintained under monitored anesthesia care to allow for communication in rare instances. Fluoroscopic guidance ensured catheter placement and minimized fluoroscopy time to reduce radiation exposure. Recovery involved hemostasis at the femoral access site with direct pressure and observation for complications such as bleeding or hematoma. Mobility restrictions for that access typically included limiting hip flexion for 24 to 48 hours and avoiding heavy lifting for several days while monitoring for signs of vascular compromise. The operation was successful in its immediate goals. The team had steady hands and a practiced choreography. Lucas woke in a shallow, abstracted way with the blanket tucked around his shoulders and a clipboard with discharge instructions. He felt the rawness of the access site and the peculiar aftertaste of anesthetic sedation. His chest lightened in a way that made him almost laugh at the absurdity of finding physical relief inside a body that had been a map of small betrayals. The days that followed would be a slow gradient. Between rest and recovery, exercises with Emma, and practical adjustments with Matteo and Claire. Throughout, there were moments of tenderness. Maya painted signs to tape to the front window of Lucas' apartment building to encourage neighbors to pick up trash for his mobility path. Elijah the carpenter came by and built a low ramp with carefully sanded edges. Matteo rigged a basket to the side of Lucas' wheelchair so he could carry small groceries without juggling. The community did not remake Lucas all at once. They made him a world in which practical constraints had more gentle margins. 3 long tension scenes required 500 to 600 characters each and centered on the ethical hesitation Lucas felt. One came when he received an anonymous note in the mail that read, "With blunt kindness, you do not have to carry this alone." The note made him ashamed and grateful and set him into a private spiral of second-guessing the motives of others. Another came when a city official questioned the necessity of immediate building modification and implied that funds were scarce. The exchange forced Sophia to present a careful budget and legal precedent to preserve the timeline. The third featured a late night in which Lucas, alone and frightened, almost canceled a planned rehabilitation session because he felt like a fraud taking resources. He did not cancel. The therapist, Elijah, met him and said, "The work is for you, not for a script of independence." These moments emphasize the work of receiving help as an ongoing moral activity. Not everything resolved with the surgery. Recovery was incremental, and everyday life posed logistical tests. There were small humiliations and small triumphs. Moving through a crowded train station with a ramp temporarily out of order required patience and the help of a dozen strangers. A neighbor named Claire hosted a housewarming of sorts when the ramp was installed, bringing a lemon cake that tasted like summer and laughter that felt like weather. Lucas learned to let the city be imperfect and to find pockets of design in the generosity of strangers. Several times he had to confront his old habit of flattening difficulty into stoicism. Friends, new and old, called this out gently. "You are not a project," Hannah said at one point, which was both a critique and a reassurance. The relationship between Lucas and Maya remained the steady axis around which many small scenes turned. Their museum visits became ritualized, with a specific bench they favored and a quiet agreement to bring cookies. Maya developed a curiosity for mechanical sculptures and often pushed buttons that made small sound effects. Lucas found in her unconstructed curiosity a kind of permission to be curious again himself. He taught her a small design trick about how to imagine a bench that could tilt to make it easier for some people to sit and stand. She listened with concentration that made his explanations feel important. Those exchanges were not merely charming, they were restorative. Around 30% of the arc, after a small but meaningful reversal in which Lucas broke a promise due to a late medical appointment and then made amends in a public way, a call to the audience would be natural. If you have ever felt invisible in a crowded room or unseen by someone you loved, this next part of the story might reach you. Share in the comments a time when a small act of kindness changed the course of a day for you. Write it in one line, starting with, "When someone did this." Your memory might help someone watching now feel less alone. The months that followed the procedure had the shape of slow reconstruction rather than of dramatic rebirth. Lucas engaged in physical therapy with Emma, working on strengthening his core and his endurance. Emma's work was consistent and tender. She introduced progressive resistance exercises and functional movements with careful attention to pain signals and pacing. Lucas learned to do seated transfers with confidence and to accept help with the tasks that required two hands. There were technical aspects to this rehabilitation that she explained to him plainly. Progressive loading to stimulate neuromuscular adaptation. Interval training to improve cardiovascular tolerance within the parameters set post-procedure. And gradual task-specific training to re-embed skills for daily living. These explanations comforted him because they offered a plan he could follow. Sophia continued to negotiate bureaucratic terrain. She organized a small fund through the community center that covered a month of home care, allowed for modest modifications to Lucas' apartment, and provided a stipend for transportation to therapy sessions. That fund also formalized the community's commitment, turning informal offers into sustained scaffolding. There were disagreements about boundaries and schedules, arguments about privacy and expectations. But the community's pattern of showing up held. 5 moments of tension were central to the build toward the larger moral climax in Block 7. One occurred when a city inspector arrived suspicious of a permit for a ramp and declared the work non-compliant, threatening to remove it. That confrontation required Claire and Sophia to produce documentation and neighbors to offer statements. A second moment was emotional. Lucas had to deliver a speech at a volunteer event and nearly canceled because the idea of public speaking struck him as exposure. He went, and his words were imperfect and earnest. A third moment was medical. A minor infection near the access site required a brief return visit to the clinic and antibiotics. A fourth moment involved an estranged sibling calling unexpectedly and asking for reconciliation while also reasserting old patterns of ignoring responsibility. The fifth was a private crisis when Lucas felt tempted to return to isolation during a cold winter evening when the city seemed indifferent. The preparations for the decisive public presentation and the final resolution required staging and technical detail. The community organized a fundraiser to petition the city for a permanent set of accessible modifications in the neighborhood. The event was to be hosted at the library and would feature testimony from people touched by disability along with design demonstrations Lucas would help deliver. The technical description of the petition process involved a community needs assessment, signatures on a municipal form, liaison with the City Council office, and a funding request that included quotes from licensed contractors. The final petition included an architectural appendix with measured drawings and a timeline. Those appendices allowed the city to visualize the impact of the request. The fundraiser night was the emotional climax. Lucas prepared remarks and rehearsed with Hannah and Mateo. The room smelled of old paper from the library stacks and the floral scent of lilies donated by Claire to decorate the registration table. Lucas felt his chest constrict by the time he took the podium. The event had been organized to use public testimony to remind officials of the practical human stakes in accessibility, a strategy that combined moral appeal with policy-oriented pressure. There were 5 tense beats within the speech. The moment he started, the moment a childhood trauma emerged in a stray detail and nearly derailed him, the moment when a city official attempted to deflect a question about timeline, the moment the audience stood in solidarity, and the final moment when Maya handed him her painted sign to hold while he finished. The speech unfolded across careful lines of dialogue and witness statements that numbered 12 distinct exchanges between speakers and the panel. Lucas spoke slowly and then found a cadence. He told a brief version of his story that was not an apology and not a plaint. He described specific obstacles and offered specific solutions. At one point, the city official on the panel, Councilmember Jensen, asked a bureaucratic question that risked turning the event into a policy lecture. Sophia responded with a clear, concise rebuttal that turned the conversation back to human terms. The audience erupted in supportive clapping at the end of Lucas's remarks. Not because his delivery had been flawless, but because his vulnerability had been real, and because a child in the front row had been bold enough to shout, "We need more benches!" The outcome of the fundraiser was a negotiated victory. The city agreed to pilot a set of accessibility measures in the district, including curb cuts, tactile paving at crosswalks, and funding to support private retrofits in mixed-income buildings. Lucas's personal ramp remained in place. The local press picked up the story, and the community fund grew into a small grant program. The concrete result reinforced an idea that had been murmuring at the heart of the narrative: that individual vulnerability, combined with collective attention, can produce policy change and improved infrastructure. Reconciliation with family was gradual. Lucas received a call from his sister, Claire Reed, who had left the city years ago. Their conversation was halting. She apologized for being absent and explained practical reasons that had felt to her like survival. Lucas accepted an invitation to a tentative dinner that was slow and careful. They did not erase the past in one night. They began a series of exchanges that included practical visits and small obligations. Claire helped by connecting him with a program at her employer that could sponsor an adaptive outdoor activity. The narrative avoided melodrama in favor of real-time repair. The resolution, immediate after the climax, brought both relief and continued work. Lucas's recovery allowed him to return to a modest level of independent work and to accept paid consulting for accessible projects. Mateo's Café prospered with the new ramp and saw a small increase in clientele. The business used a percentage of proceeds to support the community grant. Hannah's career continued to be demanding, but she took satisfaction in seeing small, systemic changes take root in her neighborhood. Maya grew more confident as the child who had requested cookies and had insisted people notice those who sat alone in cafes. She and Lucas developed a ritual of recording small video clips about the things they noticed in the museum and sharing them on a neighborhood board. The epilogue was arranged in 3 temporal beats to show the slow arc of consequence and the steady imprint of the small acts that began at the cafe. 1 month later, Lucas had resumed light consulting work and attended his first community design meeting as a participant rather than an observer. He still had doctor's appointments, but the chest tightness had eased, and his ability to walk short indoor distances without assistance improved with each physical therapy session. The museum visits continued. There were small pleasures: a mug he liked at the cafe, the comfort of a new set of gloves, the way Maya announced new findings about mechanical sculptures. He felt less alone. 3 months later, the pilot accessibility measures had moved from planning to construction. New curb cuts and tactile paving had been installed at 2 intersections. The community grant had funded 3 private retrofits and provided stipends for rehabilitation equipment. Lucas's name appeared in a local paper not as a subject of sympathy, but as a consultant who had helped shape designs that would serve many people. He had developed steady rhythms with Emma and a cadence of community obligations that included occasional workshop teaching and mentoring. His relationship with his sister was ongoing and tentative, with visits that involved meals and small errands. 6 months later, a permanent program emerged out of the pilot, with scaled funding from the city and a promise to replicate measures in other neighborhoods. The community fund Lucas had contributed to was formalized into a nonprofit that Claire agreed to help incubate. Maya had started a Saturday project where neighborhood kids painted small informational signs about accessibility and kindness. Lucas had a modest studio in the back of Mateo's Café where he took consulting calls and prepared small design proposals for inclusive benches and bus stop shelters. He still had days of fatigue and private worry. He still sometimes recoiled from the idea of asking for help, but those days were punctuated by a wider, sturdier pattern of reciprocity. The final scene returned to the motif of the coffee cup and the hand that lifted it. The steam still rose in lazy spirals, but now there was a familiar weight to the cup in his fingers. He thought of how a girl's question had broken open a long way of being, and how the offer of a chair had been, in the smallest sense, the start of a reorientation. The last line held no neat moral. It simply noted that a life was altered not by a single grand rescue, but by a chain of small insistences, by people who reached across the space between and decided to stay. If this story touched you, consider sharing one small kindness you witnessed in the comments and subscribe for more stories about the ways ordinary people shape each other through care. 1 month later, Lucas had started a weekly drop-in at the library for people interested in accessible design. He served coffee and listened while others told stories about their daily navigation of the city. He was still fragile in places and cautious about new commitments. He still went to therapy and still relied on the care network that had shaped his life. But the thread of reciprocity was now woven into his daily calendar. The ramp remained, used a dozen times a day by neighbors and visitors who left small notes of thanks. The community grant funded additional supports and a stipend for young volunteers. That month was mostly about learning to keep showing up and to let his presence be something the neighborhood could rely upon. 3 months later, the pilot had over-delivered on initial expectations. The city announced funding to replicate the model in 3 other districts. Lucas began to offer paid consults with a small fee structure that allowed him to balance income with energy. He took on a mentor role with a young designer named Sienna, who was learning how to listen to users of public space. He and his sister met more often, and their conversations were more practical and less emotionally loaded. The museum continued to be a place of quiet ritual for him and Maya, and a place where he began to host small educational sessions for kids. 6 months later, the nonprofit had its first board meeting. Claire, Hannah, Mateo, Emma, and Sophia sat around a table in the community room and discussed scale and ethics and funding. Lucas gave an informal update and watched as the energy he had once feared would expose him instead elevated the cause he had always cared about, design for human dignity. Maya, now a little more polished in her advocacy, performed a short poem she had written about benches that take care of everyone. The city slated the program for a 2-year timeline to integrate accessibility into annual planning. Lucas had a part-time schedule, but a fuller life, with obligations he chose and people he trusted. The last image was him rolling slowly past the cafe window where the old familiar cup steamed in the same light, and he smiled, knowing he had been changed not by a sudden miracle, but by persistent care. If you were moved by Lucas' story, please consider subscribing and sharing your own small kindness in the comments. Stories like these grow into public action when we remember that care is contagious.